Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to UAP Therapist Podcast, episode 022. I'm your host, Eric Schlimmer, a licensed therapist in beautiful Colorado Springs. If this is your first time joining me, welcome, my friend. And if you are a returning viewer, welcome back, my friends. It is always good to see you here. And in just a moment, it will be good to see my co-host, Amanda, and our guest today, Graeme Rendall from jolly old England. Now, at the beginning of each episode, I shuffle my papers, and that's because I'm going to talk about UAPs, mental health, or something in between. And today, I would like to talk about discernment when it comes to UAPs. So the saying is, everything in reason. So there are groups of people, and this may not be best, is that if they're unsure what it is that they see in the sky, they declare it a UAP. Now it comes down to semantics. So what some people will say is, well, UAP means anything that's not identified. And of course, they're going with the U in the initialism of unidentified. But it's common knowledge that UAP is synonymous with spaceship or aliens on board a craft or something like that. It's become very defined. So UAP is not used just to say, yeah, I saw something and I'm not sure what it was. So if I see something in the mountains here and I'm not sure if it's a bat or a bird, I'm not going to say it's a UAP because that implies that I saw something otherworldly. So backing up a second, somebody will see something, they're not sure what it was, therefore, they are not sure it's a UAP. So maybe people do it for sensationalism. They'll say the U.S. shot down a UAP over Alaska. No, they shot down something. We don't know what exactly. And I could have swore there was an initialism or an acronym for just that. So we know it's not prosaic and we know it's not a UAP, and so we're not sure. And I reached out to a couple of people I know in the UAP community who know what they're talking about, and they're like, yeah, I don't know what that initialism or acronym is. So I can't recall. Anyway, we've got this one group who are very excited, very enthusiastic, and quick to call something a UAP. Right? And that's not best. Then we have another group that does the opposite. These would mainly be debunkers. We'll go something like, it's a red orb that was moving erratically with no visible means of propulsion, and it didn't resemble aircraft, and it shot up straight from the sky, like into space, and it has all the characteristics of a UAP. And these folks will say it's not. It can be explained in very innocent ways of something that 2024 humans are very familiar with. Now, there are, of course, many cases where that's true, but not if you use the process of elimination. So I'll give you two examples, and they're personal examples. So I've told my UAP interaction story a few times now. I've been interviewed about it, and I've told the full story on this podcast a while ago. It was like the third or fourth episode of this podcast. And if you listen to what I have to say, it's a UAP. That's it. There's no other explanation. And so that's where the term is being used correctly. And how I arrived at that is I did my homework and I also enlisted the help of a mutual UFO network, MUFON, field investigator. And we couldn't figure out what it was. And I did extensive research into that incident beyond what MUFON did. We really put our heads together and worked well together on this. It's not drone, shooting star, moon, sun, helicopter, aircraft, fixed wing aircraft, anything like that. Everything had been thoroughly, unbiasedly, and carefully eliminated. And since UAPs exist, that's your answer. That must be the answer because no other answer fits. Now, going back to that first group, I have another story, and this just happened a couple days, so I now have a dog. And I wake up early. I usually get up around 5:30, but I slept in and got up at 6. And it's still dark here in Colorado at 6. It starts to get light around 6:30, and then you can see everything around 7. It's pretty much daylight by 7. And I go out on the porch here because she has to do her business, and I like looking up at the night sky. It's pretty, and who knows, maybe I'll see something. I'm very familiar with the night sky because I've camped out more than 1,000 nights. And I'm also familiar with aircraft from my time in the military, which I worked around mostly at night. So I kind of know what the night sky looks like. And I walked out and just looked up, and something immediately caught my eye, like drawn to it. And it's this object. It kind of looks like two orbs, but they're overlapping. It's kind of like if you took a pair of eyeglasses and took out the nose piece and kind of had them butt up against each other. And it's putting out this white, maybe a tinge of yellow light. And the light is odd. It's like sharp but fuzzy, but bright. It just looked different. And I said, oh, it's no big deal. It's some kind of fixed wing aircraft, and it has two bright white lights on the front, and it's flying toward me. Now, it was 45 degrees up from the horizon, about a mile away. It's a guess. It seemed like it was maybe 50 or 60 feet in size. But why it originally caught my eye is not so much what it looked like, but it was dead silent. Like, no noise. None. And I live in a military town. We've got Peterson Space Force Base, and NORAD's right there. I could see NORAD from my house, and Fort Carson, and the Air Force Academy, and Schriever. There's just a lot going on here. Then we have Colorado Springs Airport, and then up to the north, an hour from here, drive time, is the Denver Airport. So I have Apaches and Chinooks, H-125 life flights, C-130s, you name it. They're just kind of fly around my house. And I've been around drones before. And this appeared to not be any of those. And the main thing was it's no noise, like nothing. You would hear an engine, a jet engine, propeller, little propellers on a drone, whatever. And I watched it track across the sky. Very intentional, slow. Very intentional. That's the only way to describe it. Due south, which would be that way, the way I'm sitting. And I watched it for a good solid 20 seconds. And there are only a couple trees here in my neighborhood. The leaves are off the trees, so you can see pretty much the whole sky. And I said, well, I've got, a minute or two before it gets far enough away where it's not easily discernible. And so I took out my phone and swiped up, put in the code, opened the video app, and it took precisely as long as I'm taking to describe this. I look up, that thing's gone. It's like gone, like not in the sky anymore. And I'm just, well, maybe it went behind a tree branch. No. Crystal clear sky, no clouds. It's still dark. I enjoy very little light pollution where I live. I kind of live out in the sticks. And I'm looking around like, dude, this thing's not in the sky anymore, or the lights were extinguished. I guess if you could call it lights, like in a traditional sense, you can turn them on and off. And I have a radar app on my phone, looked at the radar app. There's no aircraft, none, anywhere near me. There were a couple on the runway over at the Colorado Springs Airport, but that's it. There's nothing airborne. And I'm still hesitant to say it was a UAP because I don't know what it was. It's in that category of, well, it's not explainable, at least with the knowledge I possess, and I don't have a super strong reason to think it's a UAP. I mean, if somebody could explain it innocently, I would believe that. And if somebody could explain it was a UAP, I would believe that. So my point is, these two stories, you need to be, we don't need to be, it might be best to be somewhere in the middle. Because if you're going toward that first group that thinks everything's a UAP, it discredits the field. So someone on Twitter shared this video of a woman recording something in the sky, this kind of elongated black object. Within 1 second, I said, that's a solar balloon. Like, what? It was obviously a solar balloon. And then I looked at photos of solar balloons and videos just to make sure that's exactly what it was. On the other hand, you'll have somebody who will hear my first UAP experience and say, yeah, it was probably a drone. I was like, no, it's not a drone, dude. Like, I could tell you that. It was a UAP. Right? So everything in moderation, my friends. If you go around thinking everything's a UAP, everything's going to look like a UAP, and you're probably going to be wrong just about all the time because they're still pretty rare. On the other hand, to deny that a UAP is even an option is to deny reality. Now, someone who does not deny reality is our guest, Graeme Rendall. Graeme Rendall is a writer and UAP historian based in Northumberland, England. I think he's our fourth guest from Europe, so that's great. He's the author of 10 books. It might be 11 by now. And a few of them include Intercept and Identify, UFOs Before Roswell, Dawn of the Flying Saucers, and To the Ends of the Earth. You could pick up on a pattern here of what era he specializes in. Graeme has been interested in aviation, especially that of the World War II era, since he was a child. He offers great insight into UAP history that predates the infamous Roswell, New Mexico incident of 1947. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome to UAP Therapist Podcast, episode 022, our friend, Graeme Rendall. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the intro where we were talking about everything in moderation. And I also had a lot of good things to say about Graeme Rendall, who we don't know each other too well. Like most of my guests, we met on Twitter. And I was telling Amanda earlier that you have a keen sense of humor. I'm a big fan of sense of humor. Amanda's pretty funny, too, though I'm a little bit more humorous than she is. And Graeme, how are you doing, I should say, this evening? Because it's, I think, 8:32 where you are.
Yeah, hello Eric, hello Amanda. Thanks for the
Hello.
invitation. Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm really busy at the moment, not just with the books and that I'm writing and the research, but I'm doing a lot of volunteering, different aspects of the local community. So yeah, living life to the full at the moment.
Nice. Now, I watched your interview with Andy McGrillen on that
Yeah.
UFO podcast. I think that was about 7 months ago. I'm actually going to be hosting him this summer. And it's a great podcast. When I got into the whole UAP thing, I'm very young to it, about 3, 4 years ago. That was the very first podcast I watched. And I remember thinking two things. I was like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. But I was also like, why is he sitting in the dark? He's got this thing where it's like really dark. He's like sitting in a cave. I still remember that. So it's great. Who knew that a couple years ago that I would be doing this and have him as a guest? So it's coming full circle, as I say. Oh, and I
I've
just
actually
have
sat in
to,
his shed, before. Sorry,
yeah,
I've
yeah.
actually sat in his shed before because he doesn't live that far from me. He lives
Yeah.
about maybe 40 miles away now. He actually, when he started off his podcast, I lived closer to him then. I've moved in the last 18 months. And I went round to his house one day, and it's basically an outhouse. It's a shed outside his house. He has a washing machine and a dryer stacked up on one side. So yeah, it's he's in a little cubby hole. So it's not as kind of palatial as your particular studio. It's very it's very cramped. It's quite TARDIS-like for people in your audience who know who what Doctor Who is. Yeah, yeah.
Very nice. And I think you'd call each other friends, right? You're
Oh
kind of,
yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. We've known each other for a fair while now. We live pretty close. We meet each other every so often. He quite likes his Starbucks, so that's usually where we end up. Share a couple of coffees and just maybe put the world to rights. So yeah, yeah.
Now, speaking of going to Starbucks, occasionally you'll post where you go to a restaurant on Twitter. Are you a foodie? Are you like,
Oh, I wish I was. I just like food. I'm not a connoisseur by any means, but I'm lucky to where I live at the moment. We have some great community initiatives, and one particular one which I started going as a customer, but now I do some helping out around the edges. And the chef Cheryl, she's just brilliant. Some of the food she comes out with is amazing. So I feel like I should share it to a wider audience. And perchance anybody sort of turns up in my neck of the woods, then it would be a great place to go. And they might even see me there. So
nice, nice, very nice. Well, speaking about where you live now, I usually start with the same question for guests. And where did you grow up? And how did that place, its culture, its geography, however you want to put it, does it still influence who you are today? Like kind of make you
oh
who
yeah.
you are, how you grow up?
Yeah. So I have what some people would consider to be an impenetrable accent. It's a sort of what they call a Geordie accent, which is a particular part of Northern England. So people who live around the Newcastle area, which is the last major city on the eastern side of England before you hit the Scottish border, and say that they've got a particular accent. It's quite, I suppose, harsh in some ways. It's quite guttural. It almost sounds a bit like German in the way you can pronounce it, etc. I was told at school that actually learning German for a Geordie was easier than learning French because of the way that you pronounce words. We cut bits off the end of our words when we pronounce them. So it's not as maybe as bad as Scottish if you have Andy McGrillen on. Some people will joke that you will need subtitles because because some Scots accents can be somewhat harder to understand for some people around the world. But my accent, especially if I get into full flow, and at the moment I'm speaking a little bit more slowly and a bit more that, well, hopefully the people can comprehend what I'm saying. But if I'm speaking to a friend and we're both from the same area, then we do sort of devolve into this kind of, well, you know what I'm talking about, I you know about that, which you can't understand because it's just impenetrable. So yeah, I've got to dial it back a bit, unfortunately, so people can make out what I'm saying. So that's one part of it, but it's effectively a provincial city as well, so it's nowhere near London. So it's nowhere near the centre of sort of culture and politics and business. It's about as far as you can get in England without getting into Scotland. So it's quite remote in terms of I guess, where the movers and shakers are in Britain. And for some reason, in terms of being provincial, it's also forgotten about, economically as well. We've had decades of, underinvestment and just, well, we're forgotten about, basically. I don't want to get too political here, but it's that kind of place. So there's a lot of deprivation. There was a lot, industries were taken away for one reason or another. The coal mining went, the steelworks went nearby. There's a whole lot of things. The shipbuilding doesn't really happen anymore on the River Tyne, a place called Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was a famous area for shipbuilding. So a lot of that went. So that kind of you get an idea of the kind of place. But there are some beautiful buildings. There are some wonderful bridges over the river. It's quite picturesque. Yeah, it's a place I grew up, so I'm still quite fond of it in a lot of ways. But being provincial and going back to the UFO side of things, when you're a teenager growing up in a pre-internet culture, when you don't have access to, just information from around the world and access to other people at your fingertips, it can be quite limiting. So when I was getting into the UFO hobby, I was dependent on my local library in a small suburb of northern Newcastle upon Tyne, a city of maybe, 250,000 people in the wider conurbation. So once I'd exhausted those books, then there was a city library, which had a little bit more in terms of a UFO library. But beyond that, there was nothing much else going on. Being quite young and naive back in those days, then there wasn't the kind of UFO groups or the UFO newsletters that I knew about that I could join and get involved with. So yeah, you were quite limited, or at least I was, in what I could do, what I could research, what I could read, and what I could discuss with other people. So yeah, it was quite, I suppose, quite challenging. It's nothing like somebody if they're starting out today, have the benefit of all or everything almost at their feet. They can just get straight into. It wasn't like that back in the sort of late to mid 70s, mid to late 1970s when I first got into the UFO topic.
And guessing, did this all start when you were in a library and maybe saw a book about UFOs and you were like, whoa, what's
No,
this?
no. A lot of people do start that way when they see something like that. It did sort of start that way, but not in a library. I used to read books when I was about 8 or 9, funny enough, and I was reading Isaac Asimov. I was reading A. Van Vogt and E. Doc Smith, the kind of classic pulp science fiction novels back in the day. And I got really into these. And the fact that they had really cool looking spaceship art on the front had nothing to do with this whatsoever, he says. But my mother, she's long dead now, but she bought me another book, thinking she was doing me a favor by buying me another book in the series of novels that I was reading. Except it wasn't a science fiction novel. It was a book about UFOs. It was one by Brinsley and Poe Trench, who was a famous UK author back in the 1960s. It was called Mysterious Visitors, and it had a picture of a flying saucer on the front. Now, she thought, in her wisdom, that she was, say, doing me a favor by buying me another one of these books, but it turned out to be that. And that got me on the path to being interested in UFOs, because I took one look at the first chapter and I was hooked, basically. And being a sponge back then for anything that took my fancy, anything that took my eye, then I just wanted to know more and more about it. And so that's when I went to the next visit to the library because I was reading a lot back then. Yeah, straight to the UFO section, which there was a shelf, a long shelf in the library, even just my little local library, that had 20 UFO titles on it. And you can remember some of the titles today, so it must have, it obviously did have an impact back then. It was, yeah. So yeah, it led to where I am today, I guess.
And did that interest in UFOs, UAPs, did that lead you into your interest in aircraft? Which came
No,
first?
the aircraft came first. That started at probably about the age of 4 or 5. I was given model aircraft kits to keep me quiet, effectively. My
Mm.
father, he'd served in the Royal Navy, and he'd already bought I remember when I must have been maybe 4 years old, he'd bought a model of a ship, and he was building it bit by bit, but taking ages over it. I even remember, and this is before health and safety days, he actually had a razor blade, the ones the old-fashioned razor blades, and he'd put kind of electrician's tape around part of it so he could hold it. And that was his craft knife. He'd made himself a craft knife to cut these little plastic parts off the bits that were holding him in the box. And of course, I was playing around with this back in the day as well. Health and safety have a fit nowadays. They'd be carting me off to social services, and putting me in care, irresponsible parents and all that kind of thing. But this is how people lived back in the 1970s. If you cut yourself and you cut your finger off, well, it was just your own stupid fault, basically. So, and this is how it worked. So yeah, and of course, him building that, that got me sort of thinking I would like to build my own thing, but not a ship. And we actually lived near the flight path to Newcastle International Airport back then. In the northern suburbs, it was close to the airport. We were about maybe 2 miles or 3 miles away from the flight path into the airport. So I would see all these, like for then modern day jet airliners flying in, and the occasional military aircraft. Of course, they were a lot louder. And my school was right basically over my rear, well, as you would call a backyard, over the fence in the backyard, and I was straight into the school grounds of my primary school. It's my first school. And I remember being in the playground with some friends at break time, just running around, just doing what kids do. And then these 4 jet interceptors, obviously, had just come off the runway at Newcastle, and these were what they called lightnings. So they were one of Britain's first line of defense against Russian bombers back then. And their famous way of taking off they would take off normally, just come off the runway, but then they would put the engines at what they called reheat, and afterburner, and they would basically just go vertical. They would shoot up into the heavens, like, almost to 90 degrees. And the racket they made, it was just, you could hear them from miles away. And I remember this day, everybody in the schoolyard, teachers, kids, everybody just going, what? Like this. And these 4 jets just going thundering up into the skies and straight through a high level of cloud and disappearing. And that was it. Again, that was one of these kind of formative things where I was just hooked. So, I wanted to read about airplanes. I wanted to get model kits, and that kept me quiet for years. But in the instruction manuals for the models, they would always have like a couple of paragraphs saying the history of the airplane, condensed into 2 or 3 paragraphs, so you knew what you were building. And from that, I wanted to read more about these aircraft. So that's when I started getting books at the library, and that's when I really started reading at an early age. I think it was that propelled me into reading. So I was reading effectively books that were intended for an adult audience, but I was still reading them. I'd already learned to read before I went to school. My mother basically was responsible for that. But that's how I got into reading in a big way. And just, again, picking more and more. I got taken to air shows. I got taken to the end of the runway to watch the airplanes on a weekend. So yeah, it all stemmed from that.
And so you've got these 2 subjects you're very interested in. You've got the UAP UFO thing and primarily
Correct.
military aircraft, or just aircraft in general. Now, we know that the aircraft is, all the books are nonfiction. When you first started reading about the UAPs, maybe especially as a kid, was it more entertainment? And then how did you realize, you're like, wait a minute, these things are real?
I'd already realized back then the difference between fact and fiction books. You would have an encyclopedia, so you knew that was fact. You'd have a novel that you knew somebody had made it up, because clearly, the premise was something that somebody had to come out of somebody's imagination. And I guess back then I was possibly naive enough at the age of 8 and 9 to think that everything I read in a book was true. So, obviously, discernment comes later, that you read between the lines and you try and pick and choose what you think is true out of certain books. So yeah, and I already read enough aviation history books to know that people would do research. They would do in-depth research into items to come up with books where they weren't, I guess, coffee table books, which are just quite general, quite fluffy, don't give you much information. Where some of the stuff I was reading was quite detailed. So I knew the differences between how books were written and what kind of audience they were intended for. And then, of course, these UFO books were something slightly different, but they weren't that different back then, because they were still trying to give people facts and then say, look, this is true, but there's X amount we don't know whether this is true or not. And some of the authors, not all of them, but some of them would actually distinguish between what they consider to be facts and then opinions and theories, but others would be pushing a narrative to say, look, everything I'm saying is true, this is really what's going on, yada, yada, yada. And even back then, I could work out, look, that's not right, because you can't get to that point from here. That's too much of a jump in logic or even fact. So I think even back then, when I was maybe 8, 9, 10, and maybe a little bit older, when I was starting to kind of understand the difference between what somebody says is fact and actually, no, that's just your opinion. That's just a theory that you're trying to espouse. That's a narrative that you're trying to push. And of course, you see those in UFO books, right through the decades since there was books on that subject started published, and they're still the same today. On certain authors, you can see that they're not necessarily in charge of the kind of facts. They're just pushing sort of like theories and their own opinions at an audience and hoping some of it sticks.
I have
And
a question real
yeah,
quick, if I can.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Graeme, like in your opinion, what was the cultural and societal view of UAPs in the 70s when you were starting to get into it, where you grew up? Do you see any difference between how, you know, British society looked at it or talked about it in the US? What do you think?
I mean, in terms of a personal kind of view, I can only talk about the small microcosm of my friends, my relatives, the people I came into contact with on a daily basis. I can then speak maybe an opinion on more general kind of what I felt about maybe the mainstream media back then, the TV, etc. So yeah, the first one first in terms of my circle of friends, etc. There were very few people that I could speak to about this kind of topic. People who I felt comfortable about. Now, my mother and father, I could talk to them about it, but I couldn't get any kind of understanding from them because they were from a different generation. They were, well, my mother was probably 30, maybe 40 years older than me. My father was 45 years older than me. So therefore, they obviously had me quite late. So therefore, they were from a much different generation where this kind of thing, wasn't even talked about really. And they had no knowledge of this subject. So I could talk to them and they would, quite nod and think, oh, he's got a new subject to play with and keep him interested. But there was no kind of common frame of reference. We couldn't talk on the same kind of level about it because I think there was just this mismatch in terms of understanding about what it might have entailed and actually the detail as well. My father, again, he served in the military, but he still didn't have any kind of experience that he could share or relate or whatever. And they didn't know anybody who'd had this kind of, maybe experiences along these levels or read about this kind of stuff. So that was a bit of a mismatch. My friends at school, they were more interested in football, in films and in comic books. So they weren't necessarily interested in this kind of thing. I only had a few friends who were maybe on the same kind of, I suppose, reading level as I was. The people who had maybe developed a little bit more than others in terms of how much we were reading and the kind of level of, what the ages these books were pitched at. So that was a bit limiting as well. And teachers, well, that was just a no-no because you didn't really talk to your teachers about that kind of thing back in those days. You just didn't have that kind of relationship with your teachers that you could actually go to them and discuss this kind of stuff. So so the thing I was talking about before about being limited in a kind of provincial city with no internet and all this kind of stuff, there was also this other layer of kind of things that were limiting being able to discuss the topic and find out more about it. So it just basically fell back to me. In terms of a wider appreciation of things to do with UFOs, it was still a bit of a joke, really, in terms of the mainstream media, the tabloid press, the more mainstream press, or the broadsheets, as you would call them in the United Kingdom. It was quite dismissive. And so was the TV coverage. With a few exceptions, there would be occasional documentaries would be pitched more seriously and a more serious view of the topic, but they would still end up being fairly dismissive and a bit sniffy about it as well. And the more famous the person talking about it, the more sniffy it would be. That's usually how it worked. So yeah, it was quite dismissive, I'm afraid.
I love that term, sniffy. I want to steal
Sniffy.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good term, and I totally got it. Like,
Yeah.
I was like, yeah,
Nose
I
in
Well,
the
please, I don't
air,
have to explain
kinda.
it. Yes, the kind of thing when they look down their nose. Is that another one you're familiar with? The look down, you look down your nose at something, and you, yeah, okay, so that.
Yeah, I'm gonna steal that
So
too,
there was
Amanda.
a lot of so there was a lot of that going on back then. So yeah, I mean there is obviously quite a lot of that today as well, and it still goes on in the British, in the BBC, etc. You can tell they've got no kind of, I guess there's not much understanding of the topic in terms of detail. They've got a quite a superficial look at, understanding of what's happening, but beyond what's some researcher somewhere has written on a bit of paper for the anchor, man or woman to read out and stuff. I don't believe they've got much. They don't seem to demonstrate much understanding of what's happening in the topic, nor the history of it. So that doesn't seem to have changed since back in those days either.
Yeah, and you just answered because I was gonna, since we were talking about people taking it seriously or being educated or something like that, and what the press was like, I was gonna jump to today, and you already answered my
Yeah.
question: is has it gotten better? Yeah. Is it still around? Yeah.
There are,
That's
Eric, there are certain journalists who are more, I wouldn't say more receptive, they're just more open. They're more prepared to actually, sort of talk to us, to the likes of you and me and everybody else who's interested in this. So there is that at least. But in terms of a general sort of shift, I don't know really is the answer. I can only speak to, the kind of little bits I've seen on the BBC in the last couple of years, because obviously since 2017, the whole subject of UFOs, UAP, call them what you want, has grown in the media. And that doesn't mean to say it's been accepted in terms of whether it's true or not, or how much relevance or how much seriousness they provide audiences with when they're discussing it. But the bits I see on the BBC, they're usually shoved to almost the end of the hour. So you can tell time's pressing because they're going to move on to the weather, which is always the thing to do just before the end of the hour. So you can tell they're constrained with the time. They're always trying to rush an answer. They've got usually talking heads on to answer who have no understanding anyway, because they're not from that world. They're from a general kind of journalistic background, or they're from some pressure group, or they're from some think tank or whatever. They've got nothing to do with UFOs at all. So they're basically, you can't even try to work out what their viewpoint is. And they're usually just coming from somebody who just thinks, yeah, there's nothing to it. And that's the kind of answer you tend to get. So you never get anybody who has maybe the merest hint of some kind of overall knowledge about what happened from 1947 right through to now, or even earlier, some of the stuff I write about, let alone what individual cases are, or what's happened recently in terms of push for disclosure, anything really. It's just a case of, yeah, people see lights in the sky, or discs in the sky, or balloons in the sky, or that must be what they are. It's very, very dismissive, and it's just very poor, very lazy at times as well. There never seems to be much thought put into it. Doesn't seem to be much research being demonstrated. It just seems to be very, very, very low key, very superficial, I'm afraid. It's a shame.
Oh yeah, I'm in complete agreement, and I also agree they're simply unfamiliar with the material, so just kind of make it like I think you said lazy. I was thinking that as well, or just surfacey, and
Yeah.
that's the theme I get, or that's the feeling I get, or that's the feeling I get. I think that's the right
I
word.
think the thing they do actually rely on, however, is humor. They'll make a
Yeah,
joke of it. That's the basic the fallback position is, if you can't discuss it in any depth, if you get the point where you've ran out of things to say beyond the instant or the initial look, there's nothing to this, then they just make a joke of it, because that's quite comfortable for them. They're in a safe space then. Making a joke about it just makes it go away. So therefore, they can move on to the next item and just forget about it. And that's generally how they deal with it.
yeah.
You
But
can
it
tell,
might,
you get the X-Files music in the background, which is a huge turnoff for people like me and Andy McGrillen as well. He hates that.
What were you gonna say, Amanda?
yeah, I was gonna say, but that humor sometimes is like nervous
Oh yeah,
laughter,
yeah.
like there's some existential anxiety where it's just too big of a topic to even breach with some people, that they just have to laugh it off nervously and default to kind of the Hollywood perspective that it's, all blown out of proportion and, not real. None of it's real.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think it is because they do genuinely run out of things to say because they don't have knowledge of what they're talking about. Whereas if it was a political or a social issue, then you know full well that they've been briefed on that and they've had X amount of interviews in the past on that subject. So they're pretty well versed in asking those kind of questions. Whereas it comes to something like this, and they just flounder.
Mhm.
Now, the two sources I think there are two pretty good ones out there. One's in your neck of the woods, one's over here in the US. I like News Nation and I like
Mm.
Liberation Times.
Yeah, Chris
But
Sharp, yeah.
yeah, Chris Sharp is really good reporter and writer. Um, does anyone else come to mind where you're like, yeah, they get this right most of the time? It sounds like they know what they're doing.
It's hard to tell because with a lot of things, you have good days and bad days, I think. But yeah, I think for consistency on the topic, I mean, Chris Sharp is certainly, I mean, he's obviously a friend, so I've got a little bit of bias creeping here. So yeah, he's really good, and of course, he's built up journalistic contacts in the UK as well. So he has some of the tabloid newspapers he can actually sort of send stories their way. So maybe they're not necessarily sympathetic, but they certainly get coverage in a fairly matter of fact, sort of manner, which is better than what we used to have, where it was, this kind of dismissive, jokey dealing with the topic. So at least we have that. Yeah, News Nation are really good. That they're certainly consistent in the way that they approach the subject. It is done like it was any other story, like it was a political story, like it was a social story. So I think those two, yeah, I think you're spot on with those particular examples. I'm sure there are. I can't think of anybody off the top of my head. If you didn't give me those examples and you'd asked me for two, those are probably the two I'd come up with. I'll certainly come up with Liberation Times. So yeah, and other people, of course, hit the nail on the head anyway when they're commentating about things. You have people like Joe Mergia, UFO Joe. He's really good. He can be, I guess, a little bit abrasive sometimes. People think he's like that, but actually, he's really good, and I've never had a crossword with him. So, as far as I'm concerned, I speak as I find, and I think he's great. You have people like George Knapp. He always seems to come out with some really good stuff as well. People like Marek von Rennenkamp
Yeah.
as well. He just seems to be a really good analyst. He's not going out to pick fights. He's basically just looking at the data and trying to present it as, well, look, this is what is being shown. How do you get to your position from from this data if you're suggesting there's nothing to this? He's asking the people who don't believe in this or think it's just seagulls or jet aircraft or whatever, he's actually giving them the raw data and saying, well, how do you get to there from here? And he's been quite respectful the way he's doing it. So I think Marek's great. And then of course you have the insiders such as Lou Elizondo. They're always going to say things. They're constrained by all sorts of legal niceties, but you have to maybe just read between the lines as to what they do say to maybe work out what they're trying to say to you. So yeah.
And just a minute ago, you mentioned, you said something to the effect of that people in the media in general that are unfamiliar with what may have happened in 1947 in Roswell. Then you said, well, and earlier. And
Yeah.
uh, how did you? Because the subject nowadays is what's the newest information we have, right? I'm gonna go on Twitter. Maybe something is really
Yeah.
happening right in this moment, but you're back almost about a century, right? And
Yeah.
how did
Maybe not
you?
like quite there, but yeah, 8 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
8 years.
how did you choose that era?
Okay. So not only did I have an interest in aviation and UFOs at an early age, but also World War II. So because the 1970s were, with the 60s, the kind of decade of the war movie. You'd have all these films, 633 Squad, The Dam Busters, A Bridge Too Far, Bridget Remark, all these kind of things. That was kind of, I was used to watch those things religiously. Every time they're on the television, I'd be sitting glued to the TV, watching all the stuff. I was one of these kind of nerds as well. So if they had if they were using a tank in a war movie, I would know what that tank was. And it was, well, they didn't use them back then. All this kind of stuff, So, oh, that's the wrong markings. I was that kind of, well, we have a word called anorak. You might call it as a nerd. This is the kind of level I was at. I am in some ways still, unfortunately. I'll admit that. Anyway, but I was still interested in the stories and about the things that happened back then. My relatives I had fought in the war. and I was told about it. My mother lived through it. My father lived through it as teenagers. So they were on the end of bombing raids in Newcastle and during the war. So you have stories about that kind of thing. So you grow up. People in my age grew up on a diet because of the war, because it was still fairly fresh in people's minds. A lot of people, most people that you were in contact with, apart from your peers at school, had lived through it. If you like. So you had all these stories. And of course, there were still lots of books being written about the history of the war. There were documentaries on TV, there were war films, all the rest of it, and even TV shows. One of the famous ones back then was Colditz. It was a story about the prisoners of war in Colditz Castle. And that was a long-running BBC TV series back in the 1970s. So there was a lot of stuff like that. You were just bombarded with it, basically, excuse the pun. So I was really interested in that as well. And of course, the model aircraft that I was building were mostly Spitfires, Messerschmitts, Yakovlevs, P-51s, P-40s, all this kind of stuff. So they were all the Second World War stuff. So when it eventually came that I had enough time, enough space, and enough of a kind of a desire to write something about UFOs, those things sort of collided. It was like a kind of a trifecta, I feel like. It was the World War II, aviation, UFOs, Foo Fighters, all the stuff that happened in World War II in terms of UFOs. It has been looked at, but when I was, and I've said this before to numerous people, but when I read UFO books in the 70s and 80s, I could count on one hand the number of pages that were ever devoted to World War II UFOs. There was nothing, basically. You were lucky if you got a paragraph. If you got a paragraph, you were lucky to get another one to explain a little bit in depth. I can maybe count on one hand the number of books that actually had more than a page dealing with the Foo Fighters that I actually read back then, and I still have in my library. And then I think when you got to 1995, the archives in America opened up. So some of the stories, or the very few stories that were known about, some researchers managed to get into the squadron histories to verify that these stories were true. And then there were a few other a few other cases came out the woodwork in the years following that. And then some researchers managed to get in contact with a few surviving wartime flyers to verify stories and also to talk about some others. So there were a few more cases in the literature. And by 2007, another author called Keith Chester had written a book called Strange Company, which is a 200, 300-page book on World War II UFOs, not just in Europe, but also in the Pacific as well. And it was a very good book. It had some holes in it, in other words, in terms of some of the things that he was writing about weren't entirely accurate. And that was just me coming from a historical and from an aviation enthusiast perspective. But that aside, it was a really good book. And actually, I would encourage anybody to buy it or to get a hold of a copy and read it, because it is really good. But I just felt there was something missing, which was a bit more context around some of the sightings as well, to put some of the stuff in perspective, talk about some of the technology that was being used back then, and show how, despite some people that you might read on the internet suggesting these things were German secret weapons, that the Germans were developing flying discs and all this kind of stuff, actually, when you look at it, those things can't be true. And I felt a lot of that needed to be put into a book just to explain everything and to sort of burst some of these myths that have grown up around UFOs in World War II. So that was the genesis of UFOs Before Roswell, which was the first book I wrote on UFOs, which was came out in August 2021. To what I didn't expect the kind of critical acclaim it had. I'd written an article, just a very brief, I guess, 3-page article for the Debrief, the American site run by Micah Hanks, and he published that about the Foo Fighters, and it had just 3 cases in it, and lo and behold, it was retweeted by Chris Mellon as well. When I put just a tweet, saying this is in the Debrief, and Chris Mellon retweeted it, and that went mad from there. So. And I just put a hint of, I am writing a book about the Foo Fighters in this article. So, of course, there was a clamor for information. And when the book came out, it just sold like crazy. And it still does today. I'm still selling, numerous copies each month, which I'm really surprised about, because books tend to have a bit of a shelf life. They go off the boil after a
Yeah.
while. But yeah, it's still really it's still selling really well. So I'm really happy. And I just feel like if anything, if anybody says, what do you have a legacy, Graeme? I hope it's that. I hope it's just something that I've been able to add to the conversation. Not that I've been able to like explain a lot of things to people and push kick the ball down the road at all or whatever, or solve something, but just a little bit that might just maybe get people thinking, might explode a few myths that have been, around for a long time, which, clearly aren't true. And then just put a few ideas into people's heads so that they can maybe do their own research as well, which I'm all in favor of, using it as a springboard to do for people to go their own, to find their own journey, to look into the past themselves, to find actually there are parallels between what happened even back then to what's been happening, more recently, which is a thing that historians usually do anyway when they're trying to tell a story. And I have, beyond my UFO books, I write military aviation history books, dealing with that kind of thing in where the county where I live now, which is County Durham, but also in Northumberland where I used to live, which is the county just before the Scottish border, and across in Cumbria, which is on the west side of England. So yeah, I use the same kind of, I guess, approach that I write those books to writing the UFO books, because I want to deliver to an audience who appreciates the fact that things that happened back then, can be relevant.
Yeah, it's certainly a unique take, and I know I appreciate it. And so we've got Roswell in 47, and then when you were talking to Andy, you guys were discussing what David Grush brought up, which was Italy in 1933. And
Yeah, yeah.
what I did appreciate about that conversation is you're really cautious. You're quite
Mm.
conservative in saying, well, it's this. Is there a particular case that you were really interested in pre 1947 where either no one had heard of it or there actually was good evidence that something odd happened? Does any older case come to mind?
I mean, there are lots of cases from World War II where you have the pilot testimony. Now, bearing in mind it was wartime, you have intelligence reports, but a lot of those people are dead now. So it's not as if we can interview them and get more information out of them. There are no photographs which have proven provenance from back then. So that kind of media is out. I mean, there are photographs and there's plenty, and people will know the ones I'm talking about here. But they could be blobs on the picture. There could be faults in the development. Some of the Japanese photographs, they're most likely to be that because of the lack of kind of materials they had for the developing process. Apparently, there's rumors that the nitrates or whatever they had in the type of that they needed to actually develop their film was, it was low grade, so therefore the actual images that they came out with were substandard. So you can imagine any defects might have been amplified. So therefore these fuzzy blobs that appear on these photographs of Japanese airplanes during the war, they're nothing more than just maybe marks on the film. So photographs really don't work in terms of evidence. But to me, pilot testimony does, especially when these things were so out of the ordinary that they actually did make a mark on the intelligence services. So there would be intelligence reports, there would be analysis afterwards, sometimes for many months after certain events, or for long-running series of events that the Allies couldn't explain. And I'm not talking about the Foo Fighters here, because that was actually a name for a particular phenomenon which sort of occurred sort of 44 to 45, right at the end of the war in Europe, at least. But some things like lights that were following bombers, that started in 1940. So that was even before America joined the war, before Russia joined the war, in earnest. When it was basically just the British against the Germans. And there are stories in the intelligence reports of these lights which are following bombers for sometimes up to 250 miles. So that's, almost to the target and back. And there's no rationale behind it. And as a historian who has also read extensively on the German night fighter force, as not just as an air force, but also reading pilot biographies and all that kind of thing. There is no record of them following bombers for hundreds of miles, because why would you? The idea of a German night fighter crew was to shoot down a British bomber. There was no advantage just to follow them in the sky and go, "Hey, how you doing?" They weren't there to shoot them down. And the idea of the gunners on board the British bombers were to shoot them down, to shoot down the night fighters. And of course, if they saw a light following them or coming up behind them, their reaction was to open fire on them. So there is one case. Now, again, this is one I've told before, but there's another one which I'll follow up with. March 1942. Bombing raid over Essen in Germany, which is the industrial heart of Germany. They're called the Ruhr Valley, and a Polish crewed Wellington bomber. So that has 5 crew on board. It's a twin-engined aircraft. It has a gun turret in either end of the airplane, in the nose and the tail. And you have basically the tail gunner, you have a pilot, navigator, bombardier, a radio operator who also doubles as the person who fires the nose gun. So that's the crew. The tail gunner was flying back over Holland on the way home after the raid, shouts over the intercom, there is a light coming up behind us. And it was actually an orange disc. That's how the pilot later described it. The pilot at the time said to the gunner, if it gets any closer, open fire at it, because, well, they thought it was a German night fight. Well, what else would it be back in those days? So the tail gunner has 4.303-inch machine guns in the tail turret. He opens fire when it gets into range. Every 10th bullet is what they call a tracer round. It's an incendiary bullet. It basically shows the way in the dark where the bullets are going, so the gunner can sort of improve his aim, if you like. These bullets go into the light, and nothing happens. Now, if that had been an aircraft, it would have fell away in flames, or it would have exploded, or it would have evaded. Whatever this thing was, and it's not clear what it was, but this light, this disc, this orange-shaped disc, ball of light or whatever you call it, just sat there and took the bullets, because they didn't come out the other side either, as far as the pilot, the testimony he gave after the war said. After a while, it then moved around to the side of the aircraft. So it flew round to a position off one of the wings and sat off the wing. And this is when the aircraft's going through the skies at 180, 190 miles an hour. And meanwhile, the tail turret gunner had basically swiveled his turret around so he could keep firing at it as it moving around. And it got to the position, it was far enough off the wingtip, the nose turret gunner could also turn his turret and fire at it as well. And if you see behind me on the image I've got behind me, this is a representation. It's actually the cover of the book UFOs Before Roswell. It's an artist's impression of what happened. And so at one point, both turrets were firing at this thing, and again, nothing happening. It then moved round to the front of the airplane and sat off the nose. So the aircraft's still going through the skies at a couple of hundred miles an hour, and this thing is sitting at a fixed position in front of the airplane, flying at the same speed. The nose turret gunner is firing at this thing, and nothing's happening. It then just shoots up into the skies at 45 degrees and disappears. Now, you talk about the crew landed, and there's always a debriefing after every raid. Doesn't matter what kind of mission they've flown, because the intelligence officers in the squadron want to know what's happened. They want to know what the enemy flak defenses, anti-aircraft defenses were like. They want to know whether you've dropped your bombs on target. Anything else you've seen which is out of the ordinary. Were the German night fighters? Were they effective? All this kind of stuff, which would build up a picture for the next raid so they can avoid places or they can do other things. It's the way that they work. It's the way they still work today as well. But back in those days, there was this kind of culture of, well, if you've seen something strange or something odd's happened to you, then, you've been drinking. That was a thing that they would ask as well. Or are you wanting to try and get off flight operations? Or are you trying to make out you're mad? Because it was different from American crews, because you would get put into a rest center if they were tired, if they were battle fatigued. Whereas if you were in the RAF and you didn't want to fly anymore because you were sick of it or you were frightened or whatever, you were classed as what they called LMF, lack of moral fiber, and you were restricted to the ranks. You were given a broom and told basically to sweep the floor, and you would have had a special kind of like a flash on your cap to show that you were effectively a coward. That's how they treat you. So it was quite a thing to be accused of not wanting to fly, because it was a slippery slope to being judged what they call LMF. So it was a bit of a stigma. So nobody wanted that, obviously. So there was this kind of stuff going wrong. But actually, in the debriefing session, there was another crew there who had been by chance flying just behind this other aircraft, and they'd seen this thing as well. So there was corroboration of a sort. But there was as far as I can see, there's no official report into this particular incident. And the story only came out in 1962. There was by then the Polish pilot had actually emigrated to Canada, and he told an investigator out there, who then it was relayed to one of the Flying Saucer newsletters back then. But he also some time later he actually recorded an audio interview, and it's in Wendy Connor's audio collection, which are available from the Internet Archive. So you can look it up and you can listen to it. It's about maybe 5 minutes long, and it's quite interesting. And you can hear his Polish accent, because years of living in Canada didn't like take that away from him. But he talks about, if it gets close enough, give it a squirt. It's all this kind of wartime language. It's quite nice. But yeah, and you can tell you sort of lived through it. But as to what it was, no idea. But it wasn't a German night fighter. Because it had taken so many bullets that it would have exploded. It would have fallen away in flames. So that's one story, and that's actually a story of something being fired at, which was unknown. But there's another similar story from North Africa in 1943, and the evidence comes in the form of a letter to a New Zealand Air Minister in 1955, after a very famous sighting then. And this is an ex-RAF pilot from 43 Squadron RAF who was serving out in North Africa in 1943, sorry. And he then writes to this Air Minister 12 years later saying, "You might want to hear about a story that something that happened to me in spring 1943. I was flying my Hurricane, which is a single-seat ground attack fighter, over North Africa, behind enemy lines on a mission one night, and this orange light sits on my wingtip." And this is the gist of the letter. And he said, didn't matter which way he turned the airplane or whatever to try and evade this thing, it just sat there. It wouldn't let go. He found actually after a while that the kind of response to this thing to mirror his moves was a bit delayed. So if he turned the airplane, it took maybe 5-10 seconds or so to actually match his movements. So he managed to get on its tail. That's what he said. And he opened fire at it with these 4 20mm cannons. So these are, these are guns mounted in the wings. And nothing happened. This light just kept following him. So again, if that was another aircraft, how could it match his maneuvers so precisely? But how could it absorb that kind of punishment? Because those weapons weren't machine guns. These are cannon shells that were developed, designed to actually rip open light armor, soft skin vehicles, emplacements, gun emplacements, all this kind of stuff. And it would have done some significant damage. Because later in the war, when the Germans started firing cannon shells from fighters at American bombers, you'd rip a wing apart if a cannon shell hit that kind of thing. So, quite devastating. So yeah, this thing was strange. And he has this 4 or 5 page letter that he writes to this New Zealand Air Minister, and explains it all in quite exact detail about what happened. And he says when he flew back over the front lines, this thing then disappeared. But then he had enough fuel to try and carry out his mission rather. So he turned back to try and complete his mission, and it came back as well, and it sat on his wingtip again. So, but the thing at the time was, this stigma in his squadron, it was only a few people that actually encountered this thing they actually called it the thing or the light. They had different names for it. And because there was only a handful of pilots, they were not ostracized, but they were basically the butt of jokes from their squadron colleagues, because it was, oh, you're just saying things, old man, have you been hitting the bottle again, all this kind of stuff. But one by one, funny enough, as he confirmed, that his colleagues in the squadron were seeing this thing, night after night they were starting to see it. So, and this was a kind of Foo Fighters phenomenon, which the Americans, the night fighter pilots, crews operating over Europe in late 44 and early 45, not just over Belgium, France, and Germany, but over northern Italy, would start seeing as well and start reporting in huge numbers. And then that phenomenon also happened in the Pacific War as well. So, it was quite strange how actually, although the Americans coined the term, a similar kind of phenomenon was being seen much earlier by RAF crews, years beforehand in the war. So yeah, it's quite interesting. And these are cases which nobody talks about at all. It's just people like me who have a strange fascination for wartime UFOs, who have a sort of, keep sort of bending people's ears about it.
Yeah, excuse me, I was familiar, and thanks for that, by the way. I was familiar with the term Foo Fighter, but I had never heard these stories before. And this, we probably don't know the answer to this because we weren't there, but
No.
at as the UFO, the term UFO is being used. Did this story take place where automatically somebody would think, oh, it's German technology? Or are we at the point where the term is being used and somebody's like, oh, maybe it's a UFO?
No, the term UFO doesn't appear really until about into the early 1950s. So that's when it's coined. Before that, even after Kenneth Arnold's sighting in July 1947 and June 47, sorry, it was flying saucer because a journalist came up that term. But actually, the official designation was flying disc. So if you look at it in intelligence reports from the U.S. Army Air Force and then the U.S. Air Force as it became later in 47, the actual terms are flying disc. That's what they use. That's what you'll read. But during the Second World War, the intelligence reports that deal with these phenomena, actually they do use that word, phenomena, but they use that to basically, it's a catch-all term for things that they can't explain in any other way. The concept of these being possibly, and I'll use the word possibly, alien technology, UFOs, call it what you will, that's not even on their radar. They do think it's some kind of enemy technology or enemy tactics, but they're not sure what they are. So they can't get to the bottom of it. So the ones I talked about earlier, that these lights that followed bombers for hundreds of miles, they don't know why. And they spend month after month, and you see this progression of intelligence summaries each month from about the middle of 1940 right through to the end of 1942. And they're talking about what they call followings. That's the term that they use. And then it's and then phenomena. You'll see these various reports crop up. And they try and analyze them. They try to talk about how many there were, what type of aircraft were being followed. Did these well, they call them aircraft because, well, what else would they be? That was the kind of the lowest common denominator. Oh, well, they must be airplanes. What part of the aircraft were these lights attached to? And more times than not, the gunners and the crew were just saying it's just a light. We can't see an aircraft. We can't identify an aircraft. It's just a light. So that's what they boiled down to. And it got to the point where they couldn't solve it. So they stopped reporting it.
Rand Corporation recently came out with, I think it's about 80-page report. They analyzed, my God, I think it's around 200,000 sightings here in the United States. The highest chance of seeing one is within 30 miles of an active military base or an active training area.
Yeah.
And so, and Fravor, Graves, and Grush all agreed they think these things are investigating defenses, like probing. And so, have you noticed in your research that perhaps these things are particularly drawn to something to do with the military, even back in the day?
I think in terms of World War II, possibly the answer would be the sheer scale of what was happening back then. So you have to remember that not just during the day, but also at night, there were tens of thousands of people in the air, across the globe. And they're not just airline passengers or airline crews or military. They're trained observers. The idea, if you're a bomber crew, everybody in that aircraft has to use their eyes to find out what's happening in the skies around them, because the next thing you could be shot out of the sky or blown up by a night fighter coming in. So therefore, they're constantly looking around them, not just the pilot, the gunners, anybody who has access to a window or a turret is looking out and scanning 360 degrees or whatever field of view you have to make sure there's nothing coming up behind you or underneath you or above you, etc., etc. So they're always on the lookout for things which are out of the ordinary. So if you see the lights or another shape which looks like a friendly aircraft, that's fair enough. But if it's something smaller or it's faster or it's got lights where it shouldn't have, of course you're going to think that's out of the ordinary. But then if it does something completely out of the ordinary, something that no aircraft can do, then that's something else again, isn't it? And some of the things that were reported back then were zigzagging torpedo-shaped things, or things that looked like little kind of delta-winged things that couldn't possibly fly at night back then. And then, of course, just lights in the sky, which are on the tails of airplanes and wouldn't let go. So these things were out of the ordinary. And they were being reported because that was the case. And the crews they were also trained to report things out of the ordinary because it had an intelligence aspect to it. So I think it was different back then in terms of the scale, because you just had lots of people in the sky, and not just in the sky, but actually on the ground. So soldiers on the ground, you're looking to see what's happening in front of you on the battlefield. You're also looking up in case it's a ground attack aircraft or a bomber about to attack you where you are. So you have all that going on as well. So you have not just thousands, but tens, hundreds of thousands of trained observers watching what's going on. And anything's out of the ordinary, they report it. So I think that's why you have the sheer scale of stuff in World War II. But as to what happened afterwards, it's really hard to work out whether there was a focus on military, because the US Air Force actually did gear themselves up to accept reports about UFO sightings from the end of 47, beginning of 1948, when Project Sign was set up. And then all the way through 1948, and then in 1949 when Grudge took over, and then all the way to March 1942 when Project Blue Book was started. So these are the first three official United States Air Force UFO investigations, and that went through to 1969. So there wasn't, much later there was a more kind of, I suppose, preponderance on civilian sightings, but in the early days, there were a lot of military pilots and military aircrew and military ground witnesses who were reporting, which were getting into the official investigations. So yeah, you had these really highly trained observers, highly trained professional pilots, people of your government has spent hundreds, thousands of dollars training these people. They were entrusted with state-of-the-art weaponry. They were entrusted with the defense of the United States. So they were credible witnesses. So naturally, there would be a kind of a preposition to actually trust these people, to actually investigate them, treat their sightings as being something worthy of study. So yeah, there was definitely a focus on their sightings, but there was also a hell of a lot of aircrew sightings in terms of civilian airliners as well, and they were quite respected as well. But you weren't just going to dismiss somebody who was in charge of 30 or 40 people on an airplane and dismiss their sightings out of hand either. So there was that. So it was just the fact that there were lots of people flying around, I guess, that these things were reported as well. They were starting to get picked up on radar systems as well, back in those days, in the late 40s, early 50s. So you had that element. So boiling it down to, is it just because they're in the vicinity of a military base? It wasn't. I don't think it's that simple. I think it was simply that they were being reported because they had the eyes and ears more. We had the aircraft up on, or you had aircraft up on patrol quite a lot. You had much more sophisticated radar systems that seemed to be able to pick up at certain times these things as well. So yeah, you had a lot of things going on. I don't think it's just as simple as saying they were in proximity here, so therefore that's what they were being seen. That's not to say that's not true, of course, but it's probably a little bit more complicated than that.
I agree. And nowadays, so you mentioned that radar was developed, and we have these firsthand accounts, and well, the photographs weren't really that good. It could be a smudge. Is there a form of evidence that you most value these days? Maybe a pilot testimony, FLIR, something like that, where you're like, I think this is probably the most compelling.
It's a combination, yeah, and you've just hit the nail on the head there with the FLIR videos. And I think Gimbal is the one that made me look and go, okay, that is something I do not know what that is. Because you have this kind of gut instinct, Eric. I don't know if you're the same, but that's what I go on. You tend to be, your first instinct tends to be the best one. And if something doesn't look right, then that's a good one to go, okay, that's definitely something worth looking at. Whereas, although, when you used to get these old, I go back to these 1970s, 1980s books I used to read, and they would have that little photographic insert in the middle of the paperback where you had these dodgy pictures of UFOs, and they were simply smudges or little fuzzy balls. And it might just be because the camera wasn't very good, or it might have been down to the development process. But even in the 50s and 60s, people were taking these pictures of things that you just looked at and went, I don't know what the hell that is. It could be, it could be anything, let alone a UFO. It's just so bad that the picture and bad the image that I can't tell what the hell that is. And I used to just skim through it because it wasn't worth bothering with. And unfortunately nowadays, because you can, basically get away with murder in terms of faking things, digitally, then it's almost impossible now to show even moving pictures of something that you could then say, yeah, that's definitely something that's worth, oh, that's wrong. That doesn't look right. But I think gimbal, because of its where it came from, so it's a U.S. Navy footage. That it's from an F-18, and we also have the backup of the pilot's testimony, so Fravor's testimony on top of that, and Graves' testimony and other people who have come out. I just think it builds the picture up. And gimbal itself, in terms of the footage, although we don't have categoric kind of like information around it in terms of that was a pilot that day, that was that, them coming forward and saying that was me, and in this video talking about it, and this happened beforehand and that happened afterwards, and we don't see what the video is, what led up to that, those minute or whatever it is of the gimbal footage and afterwards. There's enough there of this thing that it almost looks like a child spinning top, or a little gyroscope, that the way it moves. I just looked at it the first time I saw that and I went, what? What the hell's it doing? And it messed with my head, and it still messes with my head. The way it moves, or the way it just seems to be wrong. Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't necessarily explain it. It's just literally that it looks wrong, and that to me speaks volumes. Whereas other things, you can almost, okay, I can maybe come up with a prosaic explanation for that, or it doesn't have that sense of wrongness, which that does. So that's the one I go to all the time to say, if you want something that will make you sit up and take notice, look at the gimbal footage, and then come away and say, I can explain that, because I bet you can't.
And that's the one that Merrick has spent quite a bit of time on.
It is.
And he's like, and I know what you mean by it doesn't look right. The very short clip, and apparently there's way more footage than what we see.
There must be.
Is it just does this rotation? It looks like, I don't know what the word is. It kind of looks fake, but it's not. It looks like unearthly, I guess the word is.
If it had been somebody that had just come on the internet or on Facebook and said, hey guys, look, I found this. You might be able to say, you've just made that up. You've tinkered somewhere in some computer program and come up with that. But because it's come from the US Navy and the way it was released, it's kosher. But you just think, what? How? When? Why? You have all these questions in your head and you can't resolve them. And it is simply the wrongness. And that's my kind of criteria. If it just looks wrong, then that, and I don't mean as in fake, I mean just as in it seems to defy every known law, etc. I can't really explain it. It just looks wrong, and therefore that really does make me sit up and take notice.
We had the the gimbal, the Go Fast, the Tic Tac, the orb off of the USS Omaha. That was another orb, the one going in the water.
Yeah. And they're important, these, because they're coming out in the military. They're not some guy with a camcorder from years ago, or from a mobile phone footage. They're from some serious organization. They're from the U.S. Navy, or they're from the the Air Force, wherever they come from. If they're coming from the military, then they've got some serious clout behind them in terms of proof and a chain of of evidence, which you always need when you're talking about things like this. Whereas if it's just some random person putting something on Facebook or on Twitter, then you always automatically, you kind of think, well, where's this coming from? Who's done this? What's the story behind it? Whereas this is something different. And that's why I put more weight behind where this comes from than just some, random person on the internet putting something that we've never seen before. And it could be explained, countless ways.
Amanda?
Yeah, when you're talking about the debriefs and the pilot testimonies of these World War II fighters, is there anything in your research or the things that you have read that indicates any kind of odd or not right, as you mentioned, psychological experience related to any of the things that they saw?
Oh yeah, there's a case from right at the end of the war from April 1945 of a bomber which had this thing that he describes an army blanket fly across the front of the cockpit. It was just a big sheet. That's how he describes it. And then all the electrics in the aircraft went dead. The actual the bomb came off its shackles in the bomb bay and smashed through the bomb bay doors and fell away. And it was a 12,000 pound tall boy bomb. So it was one of these kind of earthquake bombs, the ones that would try and wreck submarine pens, thick amounts of concrete that these things would drill down to and explode. So it was quite a large bomb, and it just fell away from its shackles and went straight and crashed straight through the bomb bay doors. But the psychological effects were actually on the crew, that they all started getting headaches. And apparently, according to the pilot, they were in hospital. They were in like military hospital for days afterwards, because they weren't right when they landed. He said that he couldn't land the aircraft right when they touched down. He went off the runway and onto the grass because he was physically incapable of landing the airplane. So that's in the UFOs Before Roswell book as well. It's quite an interesting story. And again, it's one of these things that doesn't really get much traction in the UFO community. So I guess that those are, if you want psychological sort of issues and effects from a sighting, then that's a prime case. But in terms of things that don't look right, the ones I talked about before, in terms, when you look at the context of what the Germans had in terms of technology, fighter technology, missile technology, other stuff that they were working on, none of it matches. Now, people aren't totally infallible back then. There were some obvious hoaxes. There were people that came out of the woodwork in the years after the war and said, I saw something strange. And actually, I've been able to prove that they weren't even in the squadron they said they were at the time. So, like today, where we have people who have made up stories over the last few decades to try and get a piece of the action in terms of the UFO, topic, there were people who served in the war who, after the war, came out and said, "Oh, I did this, I did that." And then, actually, when you look into the history, you find that they don't even appear in the squadron records in terms of missions flown at certain times when they said this thing kind of happened. So there's a few things like that in the book I put in as well, because I like to balance it out, because these myths that get perpetuated on the internet. And that shouldn't happen. You should always try and call out things when you know it's not true, because it just muddies the water. It doesn't make it any easier for people trying to read and trying to understand what's going on. But of course, that was a major part of the book, was trying to blow the German flying disc myth out of the water as well, which doesn't, it's nowhere near what people say it was. It's that the Germans didn't invent flying discs; they didn't have that technology, and you can prove it. You can go back to where these stories originate from, and you can see the people involved, and you can find that you can't find any information about them at all during the war. It's like they didn't exist. And okay, you'll get the conspiracy theorists turn out and say, "Oh well, they hid the information." Well, yeah, but there's a lot of stuff. Secret technology that was built in the war that we have chapter and verse on. We have photographic evidence, we have documentation, and that's stuff that was secret as well back then. So why isn't the same, hold for this? Why can't you find a scrap of evidence saying that we want to requisition this testing facility, we want to get X amount of materials, we want to get a test pilot to develop this program? There was some record of it somewhere, even if it was just a hint. There's nothing at all. It doesn't. The stuff about the flying discs doesn't kick off until about 1950. That's when the first sort of records, if you like, and they're just newspaper reports from the 1950s from people who said they worked on the programs during the war, and actually they were just people who had some kind of engineering background, maybe, who were trying to get shipped off to the United States. They wanted to get some money, and they wanted to be taken across the States where it was a better standard of living than post-war Germany. That's all it was.
So the witness, yep, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, so the witnesses in these reports, they were just off, they were ill, they couldn't function right, their minds weren't right. Was there anything else that you remember reading that they experienced or that they kind of came back with afterwards?
So there was actually an investigator called Dr. James MacDonald. He committed suicide in the early 1970s, but he provided information to the Condon Committee in 1968, I think it was, and also the congressional hearings that happened about that time as well. He's quite famous in UFO circles. Most people, if you've got any understanding of the history of ufology, you'll have come across the name before. He traveled to Australia. He also around America. He would phone people up or he'd visit them and do these in-depth interviews with witnesses from not just from the 60s, but also in the 50s and the 40s. He actually interviewed lots of people. He interviewed this person in Australia who was the pilot of that particular aircraft. I told you about the one that had that blanket that flew past the aircraft and they had all these psychological problems. And it was taped. So we have an audio sort of, kind of recording of his interview with a former pilot. And I was able to track him down in terms of through the squadron records and find out, yes, he was on that raid. Yes, his crew, such and such. So to a point, you can actually back up what he said. It then gets more difficult because any official documentation doesn't exist. So that's when you start to hit brick walls. Then you have to go with what he said to a point and take it as, well, you take it or leave it. So either you believe it or you don't, or you sit somewhere in the middle. And that's when, in my books, I'll say, look, this is what people have said back then. This is what I can prove in terms of what I've been able to find out. The rest's up to you as a reader. You have to fill in the blanks yourself. I'm not going to say that's definitely true, that's definitely false, because I can't. And then you have to then just make your mind up as to whether you think that's true or not. And that's what I usually do with the books. If I can categorically say, look, that's wrong, then I will do so. But I'll not, when it's a bit kind of not sure, I'll just leave it. I'll say this is as far as I get. Now it's up to you. I think it's important to actually distinguish where you're not filling blanks for people as a reader, because that's not an author's job. It's to put in terms of a non-fiction book, it's to put the facts as you see them and how you find them. You can have opinions, fair enough, but then you can provide context, which is great. But there comes a point where you've just got to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Amanda?
Oh, I just that name you said, it was Dr. James McConnell. That was the
McDonald.
McDonald. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Thank you for telling me that.
Okay, I'm just standing up this side because I've got cramp in my leg. Oh, yeah, it's fine. Oh God, I'm going to terminate this now if you don't mind. I'm in agony. Oh God, sorry. No, sorry. It's fine. It's just eased. Oh hell, sorry. That was really sore just for a second there. I just had cramp in my thigh. I've never had it there before.
Do we need a short yoga break?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I tend to get cramp in my toe in one of my in the toes of one of my feet, especially when it's cold. And it's actually quite a cold night, and I don't have the heating on at the moment at home, so that's probably what it is. So yeah, sorry, I'm back to normal now. I was just like, ow, that was really sore. That's never happened to me before. Right, yeah. As we were, sorry.
No, you're good, Graeme. Grant, how many books are you up to now, written?
17. Yeah, 17. Sorry, I'm just I've got tears in my eyes. Yeah, 17 I am, yeah.
Where can people find them?
So they can find them on Amazon. That's the easiest way to find them. So if you just do a search for my surname, and you'll find them. They'll all come up there.
Are you working on one now, or is your research going in a different direction? What's coming up?
No, I'm always working on something. I'm one of those I guess I'm a bit of a workaholic when it comes to writing, because I'm not comfortable when I'm not writing or not researching, and invariably the two go together. So I am working on a sequel to the Foo Fighters book, UFOs Before Roswell. So I found a whole lot of more information about wartime cases. Obviously, back in the day when Strange Company, that 2007 book, was written, there was more of a focus on American cases because the author was American and he had access to the Historic Records Agency of the US Air Force at Maxwell Air Force Base. So a lot of the stuff that he was talking about came out of there. There wasn't so much of a focus on the Royal Air Force side in Britain, because he was going on what was already available from the National Archives. I've had a bit of a deep dive into the squadron records, much more than anybody else has ever. Probably just the fact that maybe people weren't aware that it existed, but the mission records for each bombing raid, etc., for each squadron in the Air Force are available. You can find them. Sometimes it involves a visit down at the National Archives in London. Sometimes you get them online, but you have to know what you're looking for. Like a lot of things with these search engines in archives, it's quite difficult to find what you're looking for. But for the last few years, I've been doing a bit of a trawl through the squadron archives. And actually, you do find stories. You'll find references to things that just are so out of the ordinary, they were reported. And they don't match anything from those days. So I've got a whole load of stuff which I'm putting together for a second book. because there's enough information to provide a second book. And I think it's useful. And then there's some other stuff around the edges of the things I talked about in the first book, which either need clarifying. There's a couple of things which have proven to be false, which I found out afterwards, and a few other things which there's more information to them as well. So it explains them further. So that's really helpful, I think, to an audience who clearly have liked the first book, but then there's more information that they can get their teeth into for the second as well. So yeah, it's worth writing a follow-up to it.
Graham, we've kept you for a little while. Can we ask you some questions, some lighter fare that we usually end
You
on?
can do, yeah. I need some light relief or some relief anyway. Actually, the pain's gone now, so I'm quite happy now.
Oh,
It's like do you know, I had like 10 seconds where it was like, ow.
Yeah.
It was crazy. Yeah, but you've never had that on a show before. No drama, guys. Sorry, I'm not that kind of person, but
yeah.
that was really sore. Yeah. Right. Fire away.
No problem, Graham. No problem. Amanda, did you have a light, fair, interesting question for Graham? And then maybe I can ask one.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. You mentioned you're always working on a book and you can't keep yourself from it. That sounds a lot like someone I know who's also your host, Mr. Eric Schlimmer, seems to be on this endless journey of trying to convince himself he's done writing, but never is.
Yeah, I'm now, I think, 3 books in. So it was I think I'm up to 12. And number 9, I was like, wow. I'm done. I am so sick of writing. It takes too much time. And no one fell for it except me. And yeah, I say I'm a binge writer. I just kind of go for it.
Binge writer. Yeah.
When I finish a book, I'll have like a week, I think, where I'll think, I'm going to have a bit of a rest. And I tell myself usually I'll have a month. It never ever lasts that long. Sometimes with 3 or 4 days, I'm getting kind of itchy fingers. I want to do something and I want to be productive and I want to spend some of my time actually just writing because I just love it. I really do like writing. I've always liked writing. Even when I was at school, I used to like writing stories. When it was back in paper and pen before it was, before you had computers and word processors. So yeah, I've always liked it. I've liked the process. I've liked what goes around it, and I've liked when you get a good reaction from your audience. That that means everything. That means more than dollars, pounds, whatever. It's that kind of feel good factor that you get from somebody who's read what you've written, and they've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah,
totally agree.
So my question for you is, what is your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. There's a question. 1984 by George Orwell.
Ooh, nice.
Okay. I read it at school, and it's just one of those where you can dip into it and you get more hidden kind of subcontext and meaning. Yeah, it never fails to amaze.
Mm-hmm.
Graham, I think you're going to say yes to this. I don't know why I think this. Do you have a garden? Okay. You seem like the type of guy who would have.
I have a garden. Yeah, I've got a garden. That podcast that you referred to with Andy McGrillen before, I actually did that in my back garden.
Yeah, that was cool. That was cool. We'll do 3 each. Amanda, you got another one for Graham here? Some fun questions.
Yeah, this one's quite odd, but I thought it was pretty entertaining. What do you think of garden gnomes?
Garden gnomes, there's a question and a half. They're creepy. Some people love them. I mean, if you go into villages and towns in Britain, you'll find people in their gardens have them as ornaments. Mm-hmm. And to me, they just freak me out. They're just odd. I think as a child, I probably had a vivid imagination that they came to life, and they were malevolent. Whereas, they're just sitting there with a fishing rod most of the time. But no, I don't like them. And no, I would never have one in the garden, I'm afraid. So if anybody's ever planning to send me one as a Christmas present, don't.
Yeah, don't waste your money. By the way,
no,
Amanda,
do not waste your money.
That's funny. So we don't know what each other's questions are. So that was kind of cool.
That came out so left field. It was beyond the moon.
That was smooth. Graham, I know you've been to the US, right?
I have been to the US.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. Is there a food here you go back home and you miss it because you can't get it there?
There's a question. I don't think so. I've not come across anything which hasn't made its way to the States yet, to the UK yet. The thing that used to like really freak me out the first time I went to the States back in the 1990s, so it's 30 odd years ago, was just the fact that you got free refills of coffee and you could all you eat buffets. Like Denny's restaurants, the Sizzlers restaurants. I think they still don't know if they still have them. Waffle houses. I don't know if they still have those. Yeah, okay. It was
Unfortunately,
just
yeah.
those kind of steak and eggs for breakfast. I think that was the thing that I thought, oh, that's nice. But it was just the fact that the food was everywhere and it was cheap, it was plentiful, and your server would bring you coffee until you exploded. And that was a thing that you never got in our country. Every time you got another coffee, you'd have to go and pay for it. Where they'd just come with a big jug and just go, here you go, sir. Here's another top up, and that was brilliant. So yeah, it just blew my mind. How cheap stuff was as well, which we didn't have. I guess the other thing that not going away from food, but the other thing that really sort of freaked me out a bit was I walked into a gas station. Well, you call them gas station, we call them petrol station, and there's a guy in front of me in the queue with a pistol and a holster. He was just a civilian. He was with his really great like automatic pistol, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm just going to step back a bit because we don't have that kind of gun culture. So that was okay. Yeah, so those kind of things, as a quite shy, reserved Englishman back then, they kind of freak you out a bit because you're not used to it. So
There's a
I'm
lot of
sure,
Americans who feel that way about
do
open
they? Right,
carry
okay,
too.
fair
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Well, and there are a lot of Americans who feel a certain way about Waffle House. It's like
Oh, that's right. I'm sure
it has a
they are,
reputation.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, as a comedian once said, if you've never been to a Waffle House, it's like eating a waffle in a public bathroom. So,
Oh, God.
Amanda, I think you have one more, and then I have one more for Graeme, if he doesn't mind.
Yeah. Who is a personal hero or role model of yours in any area of your life?
Okay, so I guess in terms of ufology, a personal hero is probably Lou Elizondo. He's also a friend, so again, there's a bit of bias creeping in there. But in terms of somebody who seems to have done, a huge amount to get the topic set stage, who was working tirelessly behind the scenes to get things done, to get things advanced, yeah, he's definitely a hero in that respect. I mean, I had heroes back in the day like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, because I'm a child of the space era. So they were heroes because of the first men in the moon. So that was a huge thing back then as well. And then, of course, people, there were wartime heroes, fighter pilots. Some of the fighter races from back in the day. They seem to be from just the kind of daring do exploits that they came out with. A hero, my dad. My dad was a hero to me. He'd served in the military. He seemed to have all this knowledge in his head about this, that, and the other. He could turn his hand to pretty much anything, as far as I was aware when I was a kid. Clearly, it wasn't the case, but when you're a child, yeah, my dad was a hero to me.
Yeah.
We recorded another episode this morning, and Amanda sounded way smarter than me. And this is like a perfect example. So she asked, who's your personal hero? And this is my question. Do squirrels live in your neighborhood?
They do. Unfortunately, we have grey squirrels. So at one time, the UK population was more red squirrels, but the grey squirrels, because I believe they're imported from your neck of the woods, they have a squirrel pox, and they carry it, and it's fatal to reds. It doesn't do anything to the greys. So yeah.
Wow, those foreigner
So
squirrels. Sorry
there
about
are
that.
yeah. Well, it's not your fault, personally your fault.
Yeah,
But
I didn't drop them off myself personally.
there's certain little pockets of them sort of near where I live where they're still reds, but the kind of demarcation line across the UK is slowly shifting northwards in terms of where the greys are colonizing and the reds are left. So we have things called squirrel watchers, would you believe? Where if you see in certain places where there's still reds, if people see greys, they're supposed to report them, and then they're humanely either eradicated or relocated, mostly eradicated. So yeah, they do that just to try and keep the pox at bay. So yeah, that's a big thing. Certainly where I used to live up in Northumberland, which is up near the Scottish border, we used to have an active squirrel watch campaign, funnily enough. And yeah. You didn't see many greys, but occasionally when you did, there was a phone number to ring and report it, and somebody would come out, find them, trap them, kill them. So yeah.
Squirrel hotline. We don't have
Squirrel
those here.
hotline. Yeah. We did have a road cone hotline as well at one time in the UK. That was a bit of a laugh. That's another story entirely.
Very good.
That was a lot more about squirrels than I expected to hear about. That was great.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Who knew? Who knew?
Don't ask me things if you don't want to know the answer.
Graeme, do you have any closing thoughts? We always give the guest the last word here.
Oh, thanks. Just I guess that obviously I've got a bias because I write historical UFO books, but history is important. It provides, a kind of a roadmap to what's happening today. There's a famous saying about those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. And we've had official investigations before in the past. We're having them now. And if you're not aware of the history of ufology, you might think that things are happening now in isolation, and then you get frustrated because progress isn't made maybe as quick as you want. If you look back to history and you see how it's been looked at officially in the past, you'll see that the things that are happening today sort of happened back then. Maybe different degree, maybe the way the characters, the people involved in it are different, the political interference is different, but actually the same outcomes still happen. They're just slightly different routes to get there. But it's worth knowing what's happened in the past to what's now happening in that future, and I think that's really important. And actually, just having a bit of a knowledge about the history of ufology will take you much further than not knowing about it.
You have it, folks. History is important. I couldn't agree more. Amanda, thanks for being my co-host again. Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, next month, I'm going to host Les Velez. He's the founder of Opus, Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support, and Clint Weldon, host of Night Shift Podcast. Graeme, thanks again for appearing. Amanda, thanks for being the co-host. Really appreciate it. And we'll see y'all next time. Thanks a lot, Graeme.
Thanks. Cheers.
This is what my voice sounds like. And is the thing recording? I think it is, because I'm tech support.